The way a yarn is constructed affects the outcome of the knitted fabric in appearance and behavior. Regardless of whether you start with your yarn and then choose your project, or start with your project and then select your yarn, it's helpful to understand how certain qualities in a yarn will affect your fabric and ultimately how it will affect the outcome of your project. How a yarn is constructed also affects the knitting experience. In this week's Technique Tuesday, we'll explore yarns that are constructed with a final Z twist. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. These items were all knit using yarns that had a final Z twist, and those are the types of yarns I'm going to be talking about today. Every yarn is constructed in several steps. So first is the fiber selection. So it might be a plant fiber, it might like cotton or flax or something like that. It might be an animal fiber like wool or alpaca, or it could be a synthetic, or it could be a blend of those things. Different fibers have different characteristics and will create yarns that behave differently. The next step is in fiber processing. So that's a place where, like with wool, it might get treated to become superwash. If it's cotton, it might be mercerized. The next step is how the fiber is actually prepared before it's spun. So what I have here are two chunks of fiber. This is, and these have been prepared in different ways. This has what is called a woolen preparation. That means it was carded, and these fibers are going in all different directions. This preparation is a combed preparation. So these fibers were literally combed with teeth to create the fibers so they will all lie in parallel with each other. What happens when these different preparations are spun is that these fibers that are in all different directions are going to create more loft in the finished yarn. It's going to have more air, contain more air, and be warmer. Whereas a worsted preparation is going to keep those fibers aligned as the yarn is spun, and it's going to create a denser yarn that has more drape and will resist pilling longer. Neither one of these preparations is better for the other in general. They each have different qualities. They bring different qualities to the yarn, but those qualities will affect how the finished fabric behaves. Once the fiber has been selected, it's been processed and prepared for spinning, then the fibers are spun into what is called a single yarn. So the fibers are pulled out to a thinner length until they're as thin as is required for creating the single, and then they are twisted together. It's this twisting that causes the fibers to lock and stay strong, because each of the fibers is only 4 or 5 inches long, and if they weren't twisted together, they wouldn't be strong, they wouldn't stay together. When you twist fibers together in order to form what's called a single yarn, you'll see that there is, the twist has an angle, and it's either going to be angling off to the right or it's going to be angling to the left. If it angles to the right, we call that a Z-twist, because that resembles the center portion of the letter Z. But if it is twisted so that it goes off to the left, we call that an S-twist, because it resembles the center portion of the letter S. Most commercial yarns in North America and Western Europe are going to create single yarns that have a Z-twist. So those yarns might be just sold as a single. This is a super bulky yarn that is a single yarn, and it has that Z-twist. This is a swatch that was knit up using a single yarn. And what you'll notice is that the stitches You'll see the V of the stitch, but the V is asymmetrical. So you have this vertical leg of the stitch, and then you have the left leg goes off to an angle like you would expect, rather than being symmetrical and having both of the legs come out. This is something that happens when you use a single yarn. So I did a video about this effect back in September, which I will link to at the top, and I will also link down in the video description. So this is what a single yarn will look like in knitted fabric. It will have asymmetrical stitches. This is not something you're trying to conquer or change. This is something to understand about how single yarns appear in fabric. So you know to expect that when you use these yarns. When two or more single yarns are twisted together to form a thicker yarn, that's called a plied yarn. And the direction that the singles are twisted together is typically the opposite direction that the single was created. So you can see right here what I have is a plied yarn. The ply is in the Z direction. That means that the singles had an S twist to them. So these were singles that had an S twist, and then they were plied together to create a yarn with a Z twist. This is not very common in North America and Western Europe. This sort of plied yarn with a final Z twist, just not very common. What's more common is starting with singles that have a Z twist and then plying them together so that they have a final S twist. When you take singles that were twisted in one direction and then you ply them together in the other direction, you get what is called a balanced yarn. And what you see is when you look at these two fabrics, you can see that these have that familiar symmetrical V in the fabric. This is a very standard yarn that you would find in most yarn shops. It has an s-ply. That means that the singles had a Z twist. This yarn right here was made from singles that were spun with an S twist, and then 3 of those strands were plied together to create a Z-plied yarn. Either one of these can produce fabric that looks balanced and looks like you would expect. There is a very slight difference though in the appearance. It's very subtle. If you look at these very closely, you'll see that this stitch right here, if you look at the right leg versus what the left leg looks like, the left leg, the strands in that leg look almost vertical. Where in this one, the strands in the right leg look almost vertical. And so whichever one looks vertical, the opposite one looks like it's a lot more almost horizontal, not quite. Let's pretend these two strips of paper represent a Z-plied yarn and an S-plied yarn. So let's look at what happens when they form the V of a stitch. When we angle them, you can see that the one on the left becomes almost vertical and the one on the right becomes almost horizontal. And we can see the opposite effect when we do it with the paper strips that represent the S-plied yarn. So it's a very subtle difference in the fabric, but it may be something that you just notice looks slightly different. These two yarns right here are both purple and they both are Z-plied yarn. In fact, they're both Merino yarn as well. This one right here is superwash, so there's one difference between them. The other difference is that this is a woolen spun yarn and this is what is called a semi-worsted spun. So the fibers are much more in a line and parallel to each other than with a woolen spun yarn, but not quite as combed as a true worsted spun yarn would be, but it's pretty close. So even though these are both merino and they're both plied yarns and they both have a Z-ply, there are some differences between them right off the bat. So this is the one that's the semi-worsted superwash merino, and this is the one that's the woolen spun. So this is what the fabric looks like before it's been washed. You can see the stitches pretty well. They're not quite as defined as these are, but you can see them pretty well. And here's what they look like when they've been washed. That woolen spun yarn will bloom when it's washed, and it'll fill in all those spaces. So it creates a warmer fabric, but it has a very different appearance in the fabric. So if something like stitch definition is really important to you, a woolen spun yarn is not going to give that to you. Here is another comparison between two swatches. This one is unwashed and this one is washed. You can certainly see the cables here, but they are quite soft and you can't quite see all of the individual stitches, but you can certainly see the cables. This is another color of that superwash merino that is a semi-worsted, and this is cables. This has certainly been washed and worn a number of times, and you can definitely see the stitches in this, and the cables look great too. So either one of these could be good for cables. They're just going to give a slightly different result. So here I've got two swatches with stranded color work. Now for both of you, these are s-plied yarns. This is a woolen spun s-plied yarn, so this is effectively exactly like the other woolen spun yarn. It's just s-plied instead of z-plied. And what you see is you have very strong stitch definition here in the worsted spun yarn. Each stitch can be seen individually, where in this color work, the stitches, you can see the color differences and you can see the pattern, but they kind of blend together a little bit. And some people describe this as a painterly effect. So it's not that one is better than the other, but you might prefer one over the other when you are doing stranded color work. So that is something to keep in mind, is that do you want something that is worsted spun so you can see every stitch exactly, or do you want something that's woolen spun that's going to blend those colors, the edges of the stitches into each other? So I mentioned that both of these are woolen spun yarns, but that this one has an s-ply and this one has a z-ply. So you can see side by side these two yarns look very similar, except that the twist angles are different. If you want to knit something with multiple yarns for something like color work, you want to be sure that both of or all of the yarns that you're using have the same twist. So if you are using an s-plied yarn, you probably don't want to combine that with a z-plied yarn or even a z-twist single. Those twist angles are going to fight with each other as you're knitting. If you use a z-plied yarn, you could combine that with a z-twist single to give an interesting effect, and those twists aren't going to fight with each other, although a single is going to look different than a plied yarn, but you're not going to have that resistance as you're working the two yarns together. The final yarn I want to talk to you about is called a crepe yarn. This is a very round yarn, and the surface of the yarn seems like it's textured. This is a yarn that is plied two different times. So you start out with singles that have a Z-twist, and then you form strands that are 2-ply with an S-twist, and then you take multiple strands of that and you twist them again in the Z direction. So if you take this apart, we can see that I have multiple strands. I have 5 or 6 different strands, and each of these strands is a 2-ply that has an S twist. So these are each composed of 2 very, very tiny singles that were spun in the Z direction, then they were plied in the S direction, and then we combined 5 or 6 of them together and then twisted them for the final time in the Z direction to create this crepe yarn. So this particular yarn is a mercerized cotton yarn. So it doesn't shrink, it's known for really holding its colors, and it has this kind of textured finish on it. It has very good stitch definition. You can see each individual stitch. This is a summer short sleeve top that I knit with it years ago. And you can see that this textured stitch pattern really shows up well with this particular yarn. This particular yarn happens to be cotton, but you can get this yarn in other fiber combinations. I have one right here, and it says baby llama and silk. It has that same sort of surface texture that the cotton yarn has, but this is animal fiber. So what is it like to knit with one of these yarns that has a Z twist? So if you are a knitter who always has the leading leg of the stitch over the front of the needle, and let me explain what that means. When you look at the stitch on the needle, the leg of the stitch that's closest to the tip is called the leading leg. It's also the leg that's attached to the stitch on the right. In Western knitting, that leg is typically over the front of the needle, and when you go to knit, you come in through the front in order to create an untwisted stitch that comes off the needle. Some knitters are Eastern knitters. That means all of their stitches have the leading leg hanging over the back of the needle. So when they knit, they are going to go through the back of the needle. Well, the other thing that knitters who are Eastern knitters do is they wrap the yarn around the needle in a clockwise direction so that it is going around the needle in this direction. That's clockwise. When yarn goes around the needle in this direction and it has a Z twist, it's going to acquire a little bit more twist. So knitters who are Eastern knitters are going to find that these types of yarns will acquire a little bit more twist on the needles as they knit. This is the experience that Western knitters who knit with the leading leg over the front experience with s-plied yarns. When a Western knitter knits in their standard way through the front and the yarn comes around the needle counterclockwise like this, and that's true even if you are holding the yarn in your left hand like I usually do, and I grab the needle, grab the yarn like this, it's coming around counterclockwise. That's going to cause you to lose some twist in a Z-plied yarn, and the twist that you're losing is really mostly on the needle. So it doesn't really affect the knitting that much, but it can feel a little bit different when you're first using it. Just like when you use any kind of different yarn for the first time, whether it's a different fiber or if it's thick and thin or if it has if it's a novelty yarn or something different about the yarn that you're not used to, it can take a little while to accustom yourself to. And you might find if it's untwisting a lot that you split your stitches, so you might need to use needles that are a little bit more blunt or just pay a little bit more attention until your body gets used to knitting with this kind of yarn. Crocheters are used to losing twist when they crochet with a standard s-plied yarn, which is why crochet thread like this that's marketed directly for crocheters, it will have a Z twist, but most yarns do not have a Z twist, and crocheters just have to learn to live with it, or they have to really seek out Z-plied yarn from somewhere. There are knitting techniques where it's really beneficial to have a yarn with a Z-ply. That is when you are doing something called twined knitting or two-end knitting. So twined knitting is a knitting technique where you're using two ends of the same ball of yarn at the same time to knit with. You're alternating knitting with one strand and then the other. So you're not doing it like stranded color work where you're keeping the strands parallel. Every time you knit a stitch, you reach underneath and grab the yarn from underneath, and so you're twisting those yarns together every time that you knit. And what happens is between the needle and where you're twisting, if you are using an s-plied yarn and you're creating more twist in the yarn on the needle, you're also creating more twist in between the needle and your hands because of the direction that you're twisting around, and it can get really tangled really fast. So a Z-plied yarn can help with that. Now you still have to untwist the yarns. The yarns are still going to be twisted around each other every row or every round, but it's not going to be as difficult to work with if you are using a Z-plied yarn. It doesn't mean you can't do twined knitting with s-plied yarn. It doesn't mean you can't compensate in some other way. It's just to let you know that there are some yarns that are specifically manufactured for people who are doing traditional Swedish twined knitting. So in Sweden, most yarns are not Z-plied, they're s-plied, but there are several mills that do produce yarns that have this Z-ply that is aimed at doing twined knitting. Just as you can learn to read your knitting, you can learn to read yarn. I've included information down in the video description regarding the various yarns I've shown, as well as resources to help you decipher the construction of yarns in your stash. For more videos about yarn and how yarns affect your knitted fabric, you can check out the playlist over here. And for videos on different knitting styles and how they affect your knitted fabric and knitting experience, you can check out this playlist here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.